In today's video, I'm going to be painting a 5-man group for one of my favorite factions from Trench Crusade, the Trench Pilgrims. This was a multi-step process, but it's a pretty quick paint job for tabletop play. These models look awesome and are printed on my Elegoo Saturn 4 Ultra. These are attached to some custom bases before adhering some masking tape to the lower lip. This will protect the surface from a dual spray of Krylon red oxide primer and some self-etching primer. Both of these are lightly applied to the miniature to prep the surface for paint. The base coat for the majority of the under armor is going to be Vallejo brand English uniform. This is applied to the surface with a number 2 brush from Redgrass Games. This is a fine tip sable hair brush, and overall I think it's really good quality. I'm not sponsored by them, so this is just my personal opinion. The paint itself is going to be applied to the miniature in 2 thin coats, and I'm not using any water to dilute it at this point. The base coats for the cape and cloth on the front of his chest are going to be Vallejo brand Olive Brown. Here I step up to a slightly larger brush to cover more surface area, plus a brush like this will hold more paint. At this point I'm not trying to be incredibly careful. I'm still going to cover the surface with 2 light coats, and I'm trying not to get it on any of the English uniform. But if you do make a mistake, it's okay, you can easily go back and clean it up. When I get to larger sections that are away from the model, I switch over to a pretty ratty brush just to cover these as quickly as I can. To paint the skin tone on my guys, I'm going to be going with some Vallejo brand Dark Flesh. Because their hands and feet are always exposed, I did want them to have a darker tone. This will be emphasized even more with the wash I apply later on, but I imagine if they ever took their helmets off, their faces would be extremely pale. Now I did apply some texture paste to the bases and to their feet, so even though most of their feet is going to be covered with a mud color later on, I want to still go ahead and paint the entire surface now. That way if any of the mud color gets moved around, I still have the flesh color underneath. Also, when it comes to some of the lighter colors like the yellows or the flesh or the grays, I'll usually paint these on in a double batch. So with 5 miniatures like this, I'll go through and I'll paint the flesh on all of the miniatures one by one. Then after the first layer is dried, I'll then go back and add my second layer. And to be able to paint the neck and the fingers, I did switch over to a super tiny detail brush for these applications. All of the leather on the models plus the wood pieces received a base coat of Vallejo brand Saddle Brown. This brown in particular is pretty warm, and I like it for a lot of different applications. It does a good job covering, and when we add the additional washes on top, the leather and the wood will both be distinct from one another even though it's the same color underneath. For the metallics on my Trench Pilgrims, I'm going to be going with Pro Acryl Dark Silver. This is going to be applied to the chest armor, the helmets, the shoulder guards, and the weapons. One thing to note here is that the Pro Acryl paint is thicker than the Vallejo, but because it's a metallic, I don't want to thin it using water. Adding too much water to the paint will disperse the pigments and it won't have a good coverage, so instead use a medium to thin it if necessary. I'm personally a fan of the Citadel Lamia medium, but every brand has their own. When painting on metallics, I would recommend to be very careful and not get it on any of the sections that have already been painted. Let's say you slip and you accidentally do, you're not going to be able just to wash it off. Those little tiny metallic flecks are still going to be on that flat surface, so you will have to paint over any mistakes. As a highlight to some of the iconography on the miniatures, I'm going to be using some Pro Acryl Bronze. I didn't really want to use a straight gold because I thought it would be a little too bright. We are going for more of a desaturated Grimdark appearance. The bronze was applied to the crosses on each miniature's back, shoulder pads, and helmet. Now here's where the fun begins, because with our base colors completed, I can add a wash. This is a mixture of Citadel Lamia Medium and Army Painter's Strong Tint. It also has a tiny amount of Duncan Rhodes Flesh Wash in there. Mixed together, it cuts down on the surface tension and allows the strong tint to flow more easily into the cracks and crevices. It also has less likelihood to darken all my colors just a bit too much. This wash is soaked up into the brush, applied to the miniature, and pulled down. The reason I'm pulling it directionally is so that the wash will get trapped in more recessed areas. And here you can see where the wash makes a difference with not only outlining sections, but also helping to tint some of these colors. Now if you find any places where it's pooling too much, I would recommend just to continue to work around the miniature. The brush will continue to deposit the wash onto the miniature, but by the time you get back around, there won't be as much in the brush itself, so it's more likely to pick it up, and that way you can remove it from that area. After the wash has been applied to all of the miniatures, just set them down and make sure to let them dry for at least 20 minutes. And here you can see our wash has dried, and because of that lower viscosity, it was able to pool in all the recesses and details. This is going to be perfect for adding our highlights on top. So for our first highlight, we're going to be adding Vallejo brand green ochre to the English uniform. Instead of doing an edge highlight, this is going to be applied in more of a volumetric manner. Basically what that means is look at your light source. Where the light is coming down, you have a highlight at the top and no highlight underneath. Now one thing I love about these models is it makes this highlighting process pretty simple. The recessed details are already built into this model, so all I'm having to do is with a very steady hand follow that highlight peak in the cloth. Now acrylics do dry fast, but with 5 models here, it is nice to be able to work on one, set it down, let it dry, and then move on to the next. By the time I'm ready to add another highlight, I know that the paint on there is fully cured. For my second layer on the cloth, this time around I'm going to add more of that green ochre and less of the English uniform. And I'm going to be adding this paint specifically to my highlight areas, because when you think about it, there's no point in having a highlight paint if you're adding it to the entire model. And like I'd mentioned in the beginning, I am painting my guys for more of a tabletop appearance. You of course could go crazy with as many layers or glazes that you would like to apply to get that perfectly smooth transition. And that's the great thing about this hobby is you can finish the models to the standard that you like. If nothing else, I'm going to be happy that they're just not gray anymore. To give my metallics a pop of color, I'm going to be applying some Dirty Down rust. Now normally I'd apply this pretty thick to a model, but for these guys I added a lot of water so that it would run down into all of the details. While all of the rust sections are allowed to dry and cure, I can go back and add a highlight layer to my flesh. Just like the cloth, I'm looking for upward facing areas hit by the light or details that I want to stand out, like his fingers. My rust has cured, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to dry brush some of that Pro Acryl dark silver on top. At this point there's hardly any paint on the brush itself. I'm only trying to hit the highlighted areas. I don't want to cover up all of the rust that I've already applied. Of course, the exception to this is a thicker application of the paint applied to the barrels of the rifles, the pistol, and the sword. The bronze is going to be carefully detail painted as a highlight on all of the crosses. Just like all of our other sections, the Vallejo olive brown could be reapplied as a highlight. Now on the cape I did add a little bit of the English uniform to the olive brown for a second pass. To paint the mud for our bases, I'm going to be using some Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black and Burnt Sienna. Now both these colors are usually very opaque, so mixing them together and adding them as a heavily diluted wash works great for this look. It allows some of the colors of the mud to still show through, but it's also seeping down to the bottom of every detail. I also use a small mangled brush to add flecks of mud to their feet and ankles. Some Vallejo white gray is added to my English uniform. This will act as a base color for the skulls and broken duckboards. Now when I'm applying this, I'm not trying to completely cover the surface of the skulls or the wood. I want some of those colors that have just happened to still show through. After these sections have been allowed to dry, I go back in and I water down some more of my mud color. This is then applied as a wash to the skulls and the wood. For a highlight to these, a dry brush of the white gray is applied on top. Now notice, like with the duckboards here, the outside edges of the wood is highlighted, but not the shadow where he is standing. To give my mud that look of rust and blood has seeped in, more of that watery dirty down is applied. Now the hem of their capes can't be pristine, so the mud was speckled onto them as well. To give my mud a sickly wet look, some Deco Art gloss varnish is going to be applied. Just like some of the other specialty techniques, you don't want to paint it on everywhere. Be selective, make sure it's getting down into some of the deepest recesses. Having some of these sections matte and gloss is what makes these types of techniques work. Using more of that white gray, I freehand some crosses on the fronts of all the pilgrims, and even though I didn't film it, I did weather these as well. To give the leather bits their own unique look, I'm going to be applying a Vallejo Umber wash. The wash that I applied earlier is still there, so this is just going to go on top of that and seep down into all of those recesses. It also helps darken the surfaces, but it does have a slight sheen to it, which in this case it works. And with that, our pilgrims are ready for battle. These guys were a lot of fun to paint. There's not a ton of detail on them, so I was able to get all 5 done in an afternoon. I've spent so much time painting other types of miniatures that are extremely detailed and they take a lot of time and effort. It's nice to paint some miniatures that are just for a game, and the fact that they're a little more simplistic just makes them that much better. I'm excited to paint more of the Trench Crusade miniatures in general, especially since I'm playing this game a lot more often, and every time I do, I'll have less and less gray on the board. So, if nothing else, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you next time.